talk to you this morning about how the idea of popular sovereignty came to shape the slavery struggle in Kansas, and ultimately how Kansans ended up defining something that hadn't been very well defined up to that point. At the end of November 1859, Abraham Lincoln arrived in Elwood, Kansas to begin a week-long tour of several of the Missouri River towns that leaned Democratic as well as pro-slavery in the region, at the time in which a number of the other towns in the territory were decisively against slavery. His tour culminated with a visit to Leavenworth on a cold and wet day in which he was feeling ill. But on December the 3rd, Lincoln went to Leavenworth and recounted all of the trials that Kansas had suffered over the previous 5 years. To Lincoln, the blame was clear. Popular sovereignty had spurred much of the violence that had beset this territory since 1854. You, the people of Kansas, furnished the example of the first application of this new policy, Lincoln told his audience. Since the Northwest Ordinance, and continuing with the Missouri Compromise, the federal government had always drawn a line between slave and free territory. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was the brainchild of Lincoln's nemesis, Stephen Douglas of Illinois, had replaced the Missouri Compromise with popular sovereignty. And with that came a foot race between the anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces for the future of Kansas. Lincoln said this: compare or rather contrast the actual working of this new policy with that of the old, and say whether after all the old way, the way adopted by George Washington and his peers, was not the better way. For better or worse, the federal government in 1854, with Stephen Douglas and President Franklin Pierce at the lead, had foisted popular sovereignty upon Kansans without defining how it would be implemented, which led, of course, to the tumult of bleeding Kansas. By the time Lincoln visited the territory in 1859, however, Kansans had defined popular sovereignty for themselves, and they had defined the power of territorial sovereignty and state sovereignty. They did so by defining what it meant to be an actual resident of and a voter in Kansas territory. In the end, popular sovereignty produced the outcome desired by actual Kansans, though it failed as a national policy to quiet the discord over slavery in the territories. Kansas paid dearly for it, though, through bleeding Kansas, and the nation paid for it, of course, through the Civil War. Stephen Douglas hailed the Kansas-Nebraska Act as a triumph of self-government, state rights, and constitutional liberty. But outrage over the law gave birth to the anti-Nebraska movement of Northern Democrats and Whigs, who saw the Kansas-Nebraska Act as a, quote, gross violation of a sacred pledge and an atrocious plot to exclude free laborers from the remainder of the Louisiana Purchase. Douglas reasoned, however, that if you got slavery out of the way, Congress could then focus on facilitating westward expansion. He was quite mistaken in that. Instead, the law saddled future Kansans with the dreadful task of defining how popular sovereignty would actually work in practice. And consequently, Kansas became the battleground in the struggle for sectional supremacy between North and South. Because popular sovereignty depended on who lived in the territory, the very definition of legal residence became an issue. Governor Andrew Reeder defined residence in Kansas as, quote, the actual dwelling or inhabiting in the territory to the exclusion of any other present domicile or home, coupled with the present bona fide intention of remaining permanently for the same purpose. How's that for legalese? In a place where settlers came and went freely, though, where new people arrived daily and where outside politics influenced the political and social life of the territory, defining an actual resident proved almost impossible. The presence of Missourians on Election Day created a political firestorm when it became clear that they intended to do whatever they could to ensure that Kansas would become a slave state. The November 1854 election of a congressional delegate in Congress proved the point, as a congressional committee later uncovered evidence of substantial voter fraud throughout the territory. However, that voter fraud didn't make much of a difference because, as the historian Nicole Etchison has pointed out, the pro-slavery forces simply had more people in Kansas in 1854. They were worried about that, though. Southerners believed that the territorial legislature in Kansas would determine the future of slavery, and they were right. The first territorial census showed that 2/3 of the residents in Kansas came from Missouri and other southern states, while the remaining third came from the north. The Missourians, however, knew that northern anti-slavery leaders intended to mobilize in order to prevent Kansas from becoming a slave state. Well, there he is, and David Rice Atchison was the one who probably understood this the best, as he said, quote, "When you reside in one day's journey of the territory, and when your peace, your quiet, and your property depend on your action, you can without an exertion send 500 of your young men who will vote in favor of your institutions." And like many Missourians, Atchison recognized that establishing Kansas as a pro-slavery territory required a pro-slavery presence. Slaveholders who looked to settle in Kansas, however, wanted assurances that the territorial government would protect slavery. And of course, these people meant to get otherwise. The Kansas Immigration Society of Missouri, which was founded in 1855 to promote pro-slavery settlement in the territory, predicted that the October 1856 elections in Kansas would be the ones to secure the fate of slavery one way or the other. The Society's leaders published an appeal throughout the South in newspapers to encourage people to immigrate to Kansas. "We tell you now and tell you frankly," it read, "that unless you come quickly and come by the thousands, we are gone. The elections once lost are lost forever." The pro-slavery legislature at Lecompton attempted to allay slaveholder fears when in August of 1855 it passed an act to punish offenses against slave property, one of the most draconian slave codes in the Union. Benjamin Franklin Stringfellow, a co-founder of the Platte County Self-Defensive Association, what a name, and brother of the territorial Speaker of the House, deemed this new law, quote, "more efficient to protect slave property than any state in the Union." The Free State contingent protested this slave code as an illegitimate form of popular sovereignty. The pro-slavery Missourians, according to Free State leader Charles Robinson, had reduced the bona fide anti-slavery residents of Kansas to, quote, "the various slaves and serfs." But the anti-slavery leaders moved forward. They met in Topeka during the fall of 1855 with plans to bypass the territorial phase and the ambiguity of popular sovereignty by creating an extra-legal anti-slavery government. Over the winter months, the Assembly met and drafted a constitution, elected a governor and legislature, and prepared for admission to the Union as a free state. President Franklin Pierce, however, denounced their acts as illegal and blamed them for causing the Kansas troubles. He, in particular, blamed the New England Immigrant Aid Company for their activities in what he called propagandist colonization. Throughout the first 6 months of 1856, the conflict escalated from a war of words in legislative halls to violence on the Kansas frontier, what we know as Bleeding Kansas. The Wakarusa War, the sack of Lawrence, all showed that the territory had descended into chaos. And the caning of Charles Sumner illustrated that Bleeding Kansas threatened national politics as well. A congressional committee blamed the pro-slavery Missourians in what they called, quote, "an organized invasion from the state of Missouri that had elected an illegally constituted territorial legislature." That's the Lecompton legislature that they're referring to, and had prevented the actual residents of Kansas from exercising the rights secured to them by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. By the time the committee had made its report, however, conditions in the territory had further deteriorated. Governor Reeder actually fled the state, disguised as a wood chopper. The committee here had made their report, and Reeder's successor, Wilson Shannon, pleaded with President Pierce to use federal troops to put down the disorder. But Pierce once again sided with the pro-slavery territorial government, rejecting Shannon's request. Pierce and his Democratic colleagues in Washington, D.C., simply refused to acknowledge what the New York Herald and other Democrats in the North were called as, quote, "black Republican balderdash." And as Kansas continued to bleed and chaos reigned, Republicans gained strength as a political party opposed to the slave power and its manipulation of popular sovereignty. Political violence subsided after 1856, but the underlying crisis remained and even intensified as the pro-slavery government in Kansas pushed for admission to the Union. The Lecompton Constitutional Convention, however, faced a stark reality. By the spring of 1857, the numbers had changed. A majority of actual Kansas residents opposed slavery. The convention in Lecompton, composed mostly of Upper South Democrats, rejected yet another governor, and now it's Robert J. Walker, and they rejected his call to submit the document to a referendum. At one time, even the most radical of Southerners would have argued that the people had a right to vote over this Constitution. Now, however, they argued, like Senator Robert Toombs from Georgia stated, that this vote would be, quote, an executive interference with the popular will in Kansas. Others, like a South Carolinian who had moved to Kansas, argued that there was a, quote, carpet sack gentry from the North, the New England Immigrant Aid Company, who had doubtless been imported by those aid societies, and that they would manipulate the popular will. The Free State government in Topeka had refused to take part in this June election in 1857 of delegates to the Lecompton Convention, citing the pro-slavery manipulation and hoping to buy time until the fall elections for the territorial legislature. They knew they had the numbers, and if they could wait it out, it would work in their favor. The Free Staters won control of the body in November, and in response, the Lecompton Convention hurriedly completed its work before the new legislature convened. Political pressure to submit their work to a vote prevailed to a degree, but moderates forged a compromise plan that submitted the 7th article of the document, which addressed the slavery issue, to the voters for ratification. Purportedly, the voters could choose a constitution with slavery or without slavery, but in actuality, they had no such choice. If Kansans approved the slavery article, the territory would become a slave state. If they rejected it, further importation of slaves would be halted, but the enslaved currently residing in the territory would stay. So either way, slavery would remain in Kansas. The congressional debate in Washington, D.C. over the Lecompton Constitution turned into a fiasco. In what one historian has called, quote, one of the most tragic miscalculations any president has ever made, President James Buchanan declared that the Lecompton Convention had, quote, fairly and explicitly referred to the people whether they will have a constitution with or without slavery. Stephen Douglas at this time broke with his president and denounced the Lecompton Convention and its efforts to force a constitution on the people against their will. This wasn't popular sovereignty, according to Douglas. Yet another territorial governor, Frederick Stanton, attempted to salvage the situation by scheduling a second referendum in which residents would vote on the entire Constitution. And so on December 21st of 1857, voters ratified the Lecompton Constitution with the 7th article on slavery by a vote of 62-26 to 569. The Free State contingent had boycotted the election, though. 2 weeks later, a second election was held, and this one ended with wholesale rejection of the document by an overwhelming vote of 10,226 to 162. This time, the pro-slavery faction boycotted the election. What does all this mean then? Well, Kansas, for one, had left the Buchanan administration in tatters. It had left the Democratic Party badly divided. But amazingly, the president kept soldiering on. He rejected the January 4th, 1858 vote and sent the Lecompton Constitution to Congress for ratification. And through a series of political maneuvers, the Lecompton Constitution was doomed in Congress by design by April of 1858. 3 months later, Kansans rejected the pro-slavery document for the final time. In defeating their own territory's bid for statehood, Kansans had won the battle over slavery and popular sovereignty. Lincoln's 1859 Kansas tour coincided with an election in the territory for state officers under the Wyandotte Constitution, which voters had ratified on October 4th. The document forbade slavery in Kansas, granted black men and women the right to vote in school elections, and opened the possibility for wider suffrage for African Americans. Again, the anti-slavery voters in Kansas had prevailed. Lincoln's prediction in his Leavenworth speech that Kansas would soon enter the Union as a free state took a little more time than here others might have suspected. The House of Representatives voted to admit Kansas in February of 1860, but the Senate tabled the bill for the next session. By the time that Kansas gained admission as the 34th state, 6 southern states had seceded from the Union. For Kansas, popular sovereignty had finally produced a result consonant with the will of the people. But it had only done so because the people of Kansas had had to define it through political action and through violence, the terms by which it happened. Thank you.